human beings being called only by a number. I have seen women having to put in requests for sanitary items. I have seen the anguish over the arbitrary and lengthy separation of families. I have seen Muslim women forced to remove their hijab, niqab or burqa for identification in front of men. I have seen the torment in a pregnant woman's eyes as she prepares to birth and bring her baby to its detention home. I have seen the cattle calls, the friskings, the lockdowns, and the constant humiliation of lining up for food, toilets and medicine. And for children in particular, the impact is tremendous. The People's Inquiry into detention exhibits many stories from children that were detained in offshore processing centres of Nauru and in Baxter, Woomera and Curtin. These accounts had children as young as 8 attempting suicide by hanging or swallowing detergent, using the razor wire to harm themselves, and description of children going into catatonic states for extended periods of time. So when, in 2007, the Rudd government exalted the promise that children would no longer be held in detention and that it would only be as a last resort, human rights bodies breathed a sigh of relief. This promise finally respected the sanctions in the Convention on the Rights of the Child that previous governments have been abusing. However, latest DIEC figures from early October show that there are 723 children in detention. This is just 100 less from the highest ever numbers of children in detention in our nation's history. Children in detention are put on waiting lists for education. Dozens of teenagers held at Darwin Airport had waited for months for access to school. This, along with developmental delays that have been proven to be a result from time in detention, as well as the mental health impacts, only serve to ensure that these children are incredibly disadvantaged upon their eventual release into our community. The Australian government's focus on deterrence has boiled down to using human rights as instruments of policy. Under John Howard, the Pacific Solution ensured the systematic human rights abuses of hundreds of men, women and children in offshore processing centres, in some cases for up to 9 years. Howard's Operation Relic signed the fate of hundreds at sea, in one instance claiming the largest number of lives lost at sea since World War II. The primary imperative of deterrence and sovereignty has been rendered more important than the consequences of detention or the value of human life or the respect of human rights. Nationalism demands loyalty in the name of identity, and this can only be sustained by having otherness. Although Australia claims to be a multicultural society, this has never been absolutely embraced. Every week in newspapers there is an article on the failings of a certain group to integrate and accept Australian values. Contemporary policies reflect Australia's long history of exclusion, dating back to the commonly known White Australia policies. And now national security and border protection in the name of nationalism are being paraded as reasons for the human rights abuses Australia's immigration policies are made of. Anti-racist social work confronts racism in the profession and exposes and contributes to eradicating racial inequalities in the wider social context. It also aims to tackle other forms of oppression that intersect and interact with racial oppression. Social workers need to engage in empowering practices to develop a society in which race is not a basis for exclusion and essentially where race does not matter. Forming egalitarian relationships across racial divides of equal power, equal access to resources, equal opportunities and prospects, and acknowledging equal work of equal value are imperative. In the context of racist policies that oppress asylum seekers in Australia, in the battle against in the ensuing racist social rhetoric, there is a long way to go. Advocacy in the form of education, research and evidence about the nature of racism in the social context will empower social workers to provide a holistic and equal service delivery, not based on race or ethnicity, but on what is a fit for that person or group. Understanding individual biases, inflections and prejudices is imperative to ensuring anti-racist practice. and to give a voice to those behind the razor wire. Particularly for working with asylum seekers and refugees, ensuring welfare service delivery is not rationed out as a commodity that promotes exclusion will maintain that social workers are working for the people and not being embroiled within the racist and harmful policies, nor being affected by the politics of fear in the name of nationalism. Before I conclude and offer up the floor to questions, I will comment on what is scrolling behind me. This is a list of all known names of people that have died attempting to seek asylum in Australia or in Australia's immigration detention centres, or who have died upon being returned to their country of origin. Currently, there are no plans to change the policies that have resulted in these deaths. As you watch these names, I leave you with a quote from William Faulkner. "Never be afraid to raise your voice for honesty and truth and compassion against injustice and lying and greed. If all people all over the world would do this, it would change the earth." Our voices have the potential to ensure that this list does not grow and that those racially discriminatory human rights abuses in the Australian immigration context cease.
Any questions or comments?
Yes, ma'am.
I thought that was excellent presentation. I really liked the way you presented Dominique's anti-oppressive practice and you tied it up. But what I'm left with is, are you trying to say is the underlying text that Australia's refugee policy is about keeping out Muslims? Because that's what you're trying to say.
Is about keeping out.
Muslims.
I personally think that Australia's policies are about excluding the other and using, so the other is in any other ethnicity that is not white, and that is evident from the fact that the UK and USA overstayed visas, there is really little being done about that. We're the only country in the world to actually implement mandatory detention for extended periods of time where there is no proportionate aim.
Yes. I know you made all those points very clearly, but you started with the word Muslim and you ended with a slide that was overwhelmingly Muslim names. So I'm just saying, in the psyche of your listener, that's what we left with. The message for me is that this policy is about excluding Muslims.
Okay, no, not Muslims in particular. The people that have died, yes, they have generally been from countries where Muslim names are predominant. The reason I used the word Muslim slide at the start was to indicate what images come into your mind when you see that word. I quickly talked to friends and family. I wasn't, of course, allowed to do research, but talking to friends and family, the general consensus of things that were coming out were things around terrorism and bombings and things like that, and fear of security. I know personally, if I think of the word Muslim, that those correlations are there, and that's because of our media that have put those thoughts in our minds. We may not think they are true, but they're still there.
But what you saw when you were in the detention centres,
absolutely,
there may be Muslim people there.
Yes, there are currently no African people in our immigration detention centre. The highest proportion were Hazaras, so the persecuted people from Afghanistan. Then there were people from Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, Tamil people as well. So, yes.
But that's the point I'm making. And what you did in that talk was make a very powerful presentation that I think you should own. That in the psyche of the Australian, this is the association, and that's what it's about.
Yeah.
And I think that was an important point. So, not to deny it, but to embrace that maybe that's the subtext here. Very powerful what you did.
Let's just ask a question about the link between racism and cultural colonialism. Can you just explain that a little bit?
Sure. This is actually some work of Mel Gray that I have been reading as well. That culture is dynamic. To assume that we can ever be competent in someone's culture, I think that is a assumption that we should not be making. So whilst I absolutely promote cultural sensitivity, cultural competence is a completely other matter. Some of the work from Mel Gray I've read has culture is so connected to language, especially. So if we are to consider ourselves culturally competent without actually speaking another's language, then I think we're straight away creating racial divides. To consider that we can ever really be competent in something as dynamic as culture, I think that really already creates barriers to proper practice. So cultural sensitivity is one thing. I don't want to confuse that with cultural competence, but seeing that we can be culturally competent, I think, it's not achievable in my opinion.
Because the other side of it, what you tend to see too, is that people, when trying to be very culturally sensitive, are actually not providing services because they're too frightened of doing the wrong thing.
Absolutely.
And that's just as bad as
I guess
providing the wrong service.
When we try and say, okay, let's be culturally competent about our practice with Aboriginals, say, we might assume that all Aboriginals will not want eye contact because that's something that has been put forward before. But to make that assumption without actually basing your practice on that particular person that is in front of you it puts us in that position of being an expert when we should just be basing our service and practice on that person right there in front of us. Yes, they have a culture, we all do, but my outlook on the Australian culture is probably completely different to yours. So to think that we can ever be culturally competent is wrong, I think, and I think we should only base our services on the person that's in front of us and still be culturally sensitive, that's a different matter. But I think also asking and not just assuming that because you're from that culture, you're from Afghanistan, I'm going to treat you in a certain way. The men that I met in the centre, they were from villages right next door to each other, and yet you had men that were completely proactive about women's rights and other men that couldn't believe that my husband had let me go. So, I mean, in their villages right next door to each other, you would assume that they would have the same culture. So I think, you've really just got to base your service on the person that's right there in front of you. And yes, be open to ask, what do I need to do to respect what you need from me?
Just a clarification. I thought I heard this in the news recently, but I'm not sure. Have there been recent moves to actually overturn that practice of keeping children in?
There have been, yes. You would have seen down the bottom, I had to call it at some point because I was going insane trying to keep up everyday immigration policy changes, so I called it at the 15th. However, what the current Labor Party has put forward is June 2011, they're hoping to get those children out of detention. I am a bit of a cynic when it comes to this. I don't believe it's really going to happen. I think they keep putting these things in place, and as we're seeing at the moment, we've got children just 100 less from the highest ever numbers than before. So whilst they're putting these things in place, they're also talking in the very same articles about opening a whole other centre in Australia. So there's no plans to change these indefinite practices. And whilst we continue to keep kids with their mums and dads, which is the current policy, which is good, whilst we keep adults, we're going to keep kids as well. Yeah.
Because I guess that was the question that raised for me.
Yeah. Yeah, no, we can't. It's more that we need to change these indefinite sentences.